Good morning, everyone. So, this week's topic is expansion and myth making. And I'm really going to focus in today upon the second thing there, that idea of myth making. That's going to be what sort of ties in both of the topics that we are covering today, the creation of what it was called the New South after the period of Reconstruction and had come to an end, and then also the settlement of the West. Both of these things are kind of tied together because it's a period in which the late 19th century is a period in which Americans in these two regions and throughout the country really uh, came to develop certain narratives about their recent past and what was happening with the settlement of the West. And those narratives were remarkably enduring. Uh, and those narratives were, to a large extent, mythologies about our national history. So that's kind of what we're going to be talking about today. So I'm going to start off by talking a little bit more about what historians do. There are kind of three things that historians study. The first thing, of course, is the actual history, what happened in the past. Another thing that historians study is how history has been represented or remembered over time. So, that second sort of historical area of study is called historiography. That's the study of the history and methodology of history itself as a discipline. So, just very briefly, it's the history of history. When you study historiography, you aren't studying the past directly. Instead, you are studying how past events have been interpreted and how those interpretations through historians' eyes have changed over time. But historians don't just look at the changing interpretations of the past by other historians. We also examine how narratives about the past get shaped by how the past is remembered or memorialized in the popular sense. The concept of historical memory, sometimes called collective memory or social memory or the politics of memory, that refers to the ways that groups or societies or nations construct and identify with particular narratives about historical periods or events. So, in other words, there is history itself, so what happened in the past. There's historiography, how historians write about the past, and there is historical memory, how society thinks about the past. And all of these things are subjects that historians examine and think critically about. So, this week, we are going to really focus in upon that third historical area of study, historical memory. We are going to look at two ways in which Americans in the late 19th century began to construct narratives about the past and how those narratives have shaped and continue to shape our collective memory of the past as a society. So the first example we're going to look at involves the South and the history of slavery and the Civil War and Reconstruction. And the second example involves the West, westward expansion, and in particular, the history of Native Americans in the West. So first off, we're going to talk about the South. And so we talked before about the period of Reconstruction and how that was a period after the Civil War in which a lot of different groups within the South, black citizens of the South, white citizens of the South, Northerners who came down to the South, they tried to recreate a new society after the war. There was a lot of, conflict and violence over what that society was going to look like. And if you'll remember, that was largely sort of resolved by the late 1870s with the country basically sort of abandoning this project of Reconstruction, and saying, okay, now it's time to move on. We've reconstructed things enough. And, Black Americans who were living in the South, the formerly enslaved people, they were kind of pretty much left on their own. So what happens in the following years, in the 1880s and 1890s? So those who came to power after Reconstruction largely ends in the South called themselves redeemers. And they claimed that they were redeeming the region from the alleged horrors that had taken place during Reconstruction, all this sort of corruption and misgovernment and quote unquote black rule. Of course, that had not really, sort of actually been the case, as we discussed. But this was the narrative that people sort of began to proclaim. So these redeemers were a kind of diverse group. Some of them were wealthy planters, some were merchants, some were kind of professional politicians. They didn't really have a single coherent ideology aside from trying to undo a lot of the reforms that had been put in place during the period of Reconstruction. They agreed on two kind of main principles. They gained power by promoting the doctrine of both laissez-faire and white supremacy. So laissez-faire, we've already talked a little bit about that idea. It's the idea that government should be limited, should not be openly intervening in the economy. And then white supremacy, that's pretty self-explanatory, right? It's, sort of their principal rallying cry in the South after the period of Reconstruction. So these new governments coming into power in the states of the former Confederacy end up trying to kind of get rid of a lot of the things that have been put in place during Reconstruction. They cut back on education and public services. As we talked about during Reconstruction, a lot of these new state governments set up public education systems in the South, which was really the first time they had these systems. They started providing things like infrastructure and all kinds of, sort of public services to citizens in the South, both black and white. During this period of the redeeming period, the people in charge of the government basically kind of tried to get rid of a lot of those programs. They didn't really pay a lot of attention to the problems of small farmers. And so the region as a whole kind of sinks into poverty. And it remains mostly an agricultural region with very little kind of major industry or skilled labor. Now, some Southerners at this time were attempting to kind of look to the future to create what they called a new South. The main champion of this idea was a guy named Henry Grady. He was the editor of the Atlanta Constitution newspaper, and he does his best during the 1880s to promote the idea that the South is really ready for an era of prosperity based on industry and diversified agriculture, moving away from this sort of domination of cotton as being the big crop. He talks about the South in his sort of writings and in his newspaper as he calls it a perfect democracy, which it was for some people, right? It was for the planters, the merchants, the industrialists who are prospering in the South during this region and who, not incidentally, hold most of the power in the state governments of the South. Some industry does develop in the region, but since the main attractions for investment in industry were the fact that the South had pretty low wages and low taxes, and the availability of cheap or even totally free labor, as we're going to see in a minute, these industries don't end up making a huge contribution to the overall regional economic development of the South. With the exception of sort of larger cities like Birmingham, Alabama. Birmingham becomes an iron and steel manufacturing center. Most southern cities end up just falling back upon agriculture. They become centers where agricultural products, things like cotton and tobacco and rice, the same products that had been grown prior to the Civil War, uh, are exported. So they get shipped there and they become kind of export centers. So there's not a lot of industry, there's not a lot of skilled labor. Overall, the region remains dependent upon the North for most of its capital and most of its manufactured goods. So there's not really a whole lot of industry developing in the South during this period. So Henry Grady's idea of creating a quote unquote new South is a nice idea in theory, but it never really comes to fruition, at least not in the 1880s and 1890s. Now, we've already talked about how the 13th Amendment, basically the loophole in the 13th Amendment allowed a lot of the states of the South after the Civil War to put in place things like the Black Codes, which restricted the rights and liberties of African Americans and made it very difficult for them to prosper, and also made it sort of made them able to use punishment and to extract labor from people as part of punishment. So if you were punished and if you were convicted of a crime, you could essentially be re-enslaved for all intents and purposes. The coalition of merchants and planters and businessmen who dominated Southern politics after the era of Reconstruction, as I said, they called themselves redeemers. They attempted to undo as much as possible the reforms that had been put in place during Reconstruction. They dismantled the public education system. Louisiana, for example, by the 1880s and 1890s, it was spending so little on public education that it became the only state in the Union where the percentage of white residents who were unable to read actually goes up between 1880 and 1900. And of course, it's black schools that suffered the most as the gap in spending for black and white students began to get wider and wider and wider. So these southern states, under these Redeemer governments, southern states ended up passing lots of these new laws that authorized the arrest of virtually anyone who was unemployed. So if you could not prove that you had a job, you could be arrested for vagrancy or loitering or all these sort of petty misdemeanor type crimes. And they greatly increased the penalties for these crimes. So it meant that this resulted in the incarceration of many African Americans. And as the South's prison population begins to grow, renting out convicts became a very profitable business. Railroads, mines, lumber companies competed for this new kind of involuntary labor. And so essentially, this is slavery under another name. These convict labor camps were terrible places. They were very dangerous. They had staggering death rates. There was disease running rampant in these places. It was just really a horrible place to be. The other sort of aspect of slavery under another name takes place with who is going to actually kind of work the crops. And because no land redistribution or no massive amounts of land redistribution takes place after the Civil War, the vast majority of African Americans living in the South remained poor. They remained without owning their own property. And sharecropping comes to dominate most of the South, which guarantees the wealthy landowners a stable labor force. Sharecroppers' economic opportunities were severely limited, and many found themselves locked into this cycle of debt and dependence. Because if you're a sharecropper, you end up, essentially how it works is your employer, your landlord, sort of gives you a small plot of his larger area of land to work, and you have this area to grow the crop that your landowner wants you to grow. And then at the end of the year, theoretically, you're going to get a share of that crop once it's harvested, and then you can sell it off. How it ends up working is that at the beginning of the year, when it's time to plant, you have to go to your landlord, and your landlord says, okay, I'm going to give you, I'm going to loan you essentially the tools and the seed and all the animals that you need to plant and harvest these crops. You're going to kind of borrow these from me, and you're going to, sort of pay me back at the end of the year when you get your share of the crop. Well, what ends up happening is that for the most part, that share of the crop that they get at the end of the year is never really enough to pay off that debt. And so they get locked into this perpetual cycle. Sharecropping was not enslavement because, at least theoretically, they were being paid for their work, and because it's not a racially based system of labor. By the 1880s and 1890s, there are many poor white farmers who are also coming to be sharecroppers. So it's not a kind of racially based system, and it can't rely as much as slavery did upon violence and physical coercion to force people to work. But it ends up being this system that sort of locks people into this debt cycle. During and after Reconstruction, from really the 1870s up through the 1900s, Southern states also imposed a series of restrictions on Black civil rights that come to be known as Jim Crow laws. By 1910, this process of restricting the rights of Black citizens is complete, and the North really does very little to prevent it. The federal government doesn't really sort of, do anything to prevent these laws from being put in place. In fact, the Supreme Court actually begins to issue decisions that invalidate the civil rights that were won by African Americans during Reconstruction and upholds the segregation that is developing throughout the South. The most famous of these decisions is, of course, the ruling in the 1896 case of Plessy versus Ferguson, which we're going to examine in detail in just a week or two. This case involved a challenge to separate rail cars for Black passengers. And the Supreme Court, in a nearly unanimous decision, the court upholds this law and says that segregated facilities are not discriminatory as long as they are separate but equal. So this phrase, separate but equal, becomes the standard by which the Supreme Court, for a long time, judges these kinds of laws passed at the state level. Now, even with the end of Reconstruction, political participation of Black citizens in the South, it doesn't really come to a screeching halt. There are a few Black citizens even serving in Congress as late as the 1880s and 1890s, but their political opportunities become more and more restricted. And between 1890 and 1906, Democratic governments in the South excuse me, enact laws in just about every southern state designed to eliminate Black voting. These laws on paper appeared to be colorblind, but they are actually sort of cleverly designed to end Black people voting in the South. The most popular of these were things like poll taxes, literacy tests, requirements that if you wanted to register to vote, you had to demonstrate that you understood the whole state constitution or, some obscure part of the state constitution. The so-called grandfather clause, where if your grandfather had been allowed to vote, then you were allowed to vote. A lot of these laws also disenfranchised poor and illiterate white citizens in the South. And all of this could not have been accomplished without essentially the acquiescence of the federal government. And so segregation is part of this all-encompassing system of white domination, in which each component, disenfranchisement, their unequal economic status, their increasingly inferior education, racial separation in public facilities, all of these things kind of reinforce each other. Now, at the same time that all of this is happening, white Southerners are developing a narrative. They're developing a view about the Civil War and the pre-Civil War South. White Southerners, especially the elite classes, come to view the antebellum South and the Civil War almost with a certain amount of nostalgia. They had been defeated, of course, and fearing that they might lose their culture, lose their identity. A lot of white Southerners after the Civil War try to reassert that identity with a vengeance, and they create this myth known as the lost cause, which almost becomes kind of a religion for some people. This attempt to revive a mythical pre-Civil War golden age of the South. This is sort of this land of chivalry where handsome gentlemen and lovely ladies are courting each other under the magnolia trees, and the happy slaves are toiling away in the fields, singing their simple work songs. If you've ever seen the movie Gone with the Wind, probably it's the most famous example of antebellum nostalgia in American popular culture. This ideology begins almost immediately after the Civil War, but it's really during the Gilded Age and the Progressive era that it begins to take off and flourish. And it's not just an ideology that's overwhelmingly popular in the South. Northern whites also buy into this idea, and really kind of it comes to be the sort of popular narrative, the popular understanding of Southern history. So proponents of this idea of the lost cause portrayed the Confederacy's cause as being noble. And most of its leaders, Confederate leaders, were sort of these chivalric individuals who, sort of these proud knights who rode off into battle, and they were defeated by the Union armies just because they were overwhelmed. They weren't bad soldiers, right? They weren't, sort of poor tacticians or, sort of bad military leaders. They were just overwhelmed by the force of the North. And proponents of the Lost Cause movement also condemned the even only partial Reconstruction that followed the Civil War. They claimed that this was this deliberate attempt by Northern politicians to destroy the traditional Southern way of life. And that, of course, ends up erasing all of the brutality, all of the, horrors of slavery. And it comes to be remembered in this sort of very nostalgic way. So you want to probably think, as you're doing some of the readings for this week, you want to think about, well, why do you think the Southerners chose to view the Civil War in this way? If history, as I mentioned before, history is what the present chooses to remember about the past. So why were Southerners in the late 19th century, what were they choosing to remember about their history? And why did they choose to remember it in this particular way? How does the lost cause ideology help them to cope with their defeat in the Civil War? And what did depicting slavery as this benevolent institution, what did that mean? And why do you think the lost cause became such a dominant historical narrative? So those are some things to think about. So now we're going to transition into another mythology that develops in the late 19th century about a different region of the country, the mythology surrounding the West. So when you think about the Old West, there are probably images, ideas, people, events that might come into your mind. And those have largely been created. They were beginning to be developed in the late 19th century, and they've really come to be popularized through Hollywood, through TV shows, through movies. We think of, the West with the cowboys, and Native Americans with, sort of feathered headdresses, and sort of sheriffs and big gunfights and all these sort of, ideas. When you think about the Old West, that's kind of, sort of the thing that comes into your mind. Now, it will be some time before the actual history of the West becomes as popular as the legends that have developed about it. If you were a cowboy, for example, in the West, most cowboys, sort of, it was a pretty hard work, and it was a pretty dull job, right? You're just herding cattle. But the myth of the cowboy as the lone gunman is very persistent. The great shootouts are the things that have captured our imagination. But there wasn't really a lot of violence that occurred along the cattle trails. Some of the most famous cowboys of legend never actually killed anybody. Famous sheriffs, like, you've got Gary Cooper in High Noon there. They're not just defending their towns against outlaws. Sheriffs had everyday duties, like they had to keep the streets clean. So it's not just, sort of this heroic figure. And of course, we tend to think of cowboys as strapping young white men, right? That's how they've typically been portrayed in the films and in the TV shows. But in reality, at least a quarter of them were people of color, black, and possibly even another quarter were Hispanic. So maybe about half of the actual sort of cowboys who worked the cattle trails were people of color, which hasn't really been represented. So the reality of Western settlement is a lot less glamorous, a lot more complex than what we've seen in Hollywood movies. For example, we tend to think of the pioneers as these courageous men and women kind of making their way across the prairies in covered wagons. And that's true. But one of the things we don't tend to think about is how Western settlement changed the environment. Wagon trains left behind miles and miles of trash behind them, garbage and furniture and abandoned wagons. And railroads permanently changed the landscape and the environment, as we're going to see. And it's often forgotten just how difficult life in the West was. Farmers often started out in sod houses, like the one on the bottom there that you see. These are houses literally built out of packed dirt. They're cheap, they're easy to build, and a lot of people lived there, in sod houses for many years as they came out to settle in the West. The land was desolate and unforgiving. You might go days without seeing another human being outside your own family. The climate was pretty harsh. There are, relentless winds and savage rainstorms. It's hot. There are grasshopper plagues. So there's a lot of environmental hardship that Western settlers faced. And of course, it's important to also remember that the West is not just settled by individual pioneers, it's largely developed by corporations and businesses. And Western settlement was really a kind of corporate enterprise. So I'm going to show you, when we're talking about the West, I'm going to show you this map here. And we have to kind of get our geography straight. What do we mean by the West? When we're trying to figure out, why do people settle where they do, we have to think about things like topography, the terrain of an area of land, the altitude, the elevation, what kind of crops grow in what environment, the climate, how much rainfall does it get, how hot or how cold it is. So this is a physiographic map of the United States, which is just a fancy way of saying that it shows the different topographical regions and it gives an indication of what kind of climate that we're looking at. The important thing to note on this map is this little line that's going down the middle of the country here. dividing the country basically in half. This is a rainfall line, and it represents a very important divide. Everything west of that line, the average rainfall per year is drastically less than what the lands east of that line experience. Up until around 1840, settlement had progressed to the edge of sort of Missouri here, which is right about here or so. And the eastern part of the plains, parts of Wisconsin, Minnesota, parts of the Dakotas and Nebraska and Kansas, and Oklahoma and Texas, the soil there was pretty good, and it had some pretty decent rainfall. Beyond this area, however, things got a lot drier. Most of North and South Dakota and Montana and Wyoming and Colorado and New Mexico and Arizona, this is a semi-arid region. And then you get the Rocky Mountains, which is a pretty formidable barrier to have to cross. And coming down out of the mountains, if you've ever traveled across Nevada and Utah, you will know that it is a fairly desolate region. It's basically a desert. And then after you cross another region of mountains, the Cascades or the Sierra Nevadas, then you get to kind of the very temperate, cool coastal lands of the Pacific coast. So early explorers in the West thought that the land beyond the Mississippi was basically uninhabitable. And indeed, early maps actually labeled this region, they called it the Great American Desert. So most early settlers headed straight for Oregon or California. The middle part of the country was a pretty harsh climate. There's not enough rainfall to support extensive agriculture there. There are very few trees to use for lumber or to shield you from the winds and the, sort of rain and rainstorms. There's very tough soil. The wildlife is abundant, including 15 million buffalo are roaming the Great Plains. It's not a very hospitable place to settle, but after the Civil War, Americans come to settle this region really in droves. So between 1870 and 1900, about 430 million acres in the West are settled, mostly by white Americans, but there are people of color as well. People have many reasons for moving west. They're looking to get adventure. Some people come seeking adventure. Some people come to escape the cities. Some people come out west for health reasons or for religious persecution or for economic reasons. Most people go out to the west to better their lives in some way. And as the nation's population is growing, so did the demand for the livestock and the agricultural and the mineral and the lumber products of the western part of the United States. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but it's important to realize that contrary to older historical views, the West was not really a safety valve. It was not really an outlet for all of the social and economic tensions that were developing in the cities in the East. We've talked about some of the labor unrest that happened in the late 19th century, but poor people, unemployed people couldn't really afford to move west and establish farms. And most people moved west during times of economic prosperity, not times of economic hardship. The other important thing to remember is that traffic in the West flowed in all directions. It's not just people coming from the East and moving west. Some people are coming north. They're coming from Mexico and coming north into, what becomes the United States. There are Asian Americans who are moving eastward from the Pacific coast. So the West ends up being this meeting ground of cultures and ethnicities that forms this very diverse place. It's much more diverse than you might think. Most people, though, are coming west to obtain land in some way from the federal government. The federal government plays a huge role in developing the West. In the 1860s, the government owns about 1 billion acres of land, and most of this land is not suitable for agriculture. By 1900, about half of that had been distributed. Between 1862 and 1890, the government gave away 48 million acres under the Homestead Act. 100 million acres were sold off to private citizens and corporations. Another 128 million acres were granted to the railroad companies. And then huge tracts of land were also sold to the states as well. So the government is offering lots of different incentives to develop and settle in the West. The Homestead Act is probably the most famous of these. This was passed in 1862. It gave 160 acres of land to anybody who would pay a small fee and agree to live on that land and cultivate it for 5 years. But it really didn't end up working as well as, it might have hoped. The amount of land that you were given, 160 acres of land, this was something that very few farmers could afford to kind of irrigate and set and cultivate that much land. This was a semi-arid region, remember, so it took a lot of irrigation. And so that amount of land really wasn't, sort of suitable. The Congress also passed a number of other different, kind of pieces of legislation designed to kind of promote settlement. Now, as you can see, all of this settlement failed to take into account that there are large numbers of people already living in this area. In 1865, there were approximately 250,000 Native Americans living in the western United States. Some of these were tribes from the east who had already been forcibly relocated to what was known as Indian Territory, which is present-day Oklahoma. Other tribes were native to the region. You have tribes of the Southwest, like the Hopi and the Pueblo and the Apache and the Navajo. There are tribes living, of course, in California and in the Pacific Northwest. And then, of course, the tribes of the Great Plains, which is, tends to be what people think about when they think about the Native Americans living in the West. So in the mid-19th century, about 2/3 of them were living on the Great Plains, including very famous sort of tribes like the Sioux and the Blackfoot and the Comanche and the Cheyenne. Plains Indians were nomadic. They largely followed the buffalo. They were very skilled horsemen. The horse, of course, was not native to North America, but had been brought to North America by Spanish explorers in the 1500s. And then it spread north from Mexico onto the Great Plains. And it really changed the way of life of Native Americans there. These tribes gave up farming entirely and began to hunt the buffalo. So they developed this very sort of skilled warrior culture. And as I said, they were migratory in nature, and they followed and lived off of the buffalo, which provided almost everything they needed to survive. By the 1880s and 1890s, though, all of that had been changed forever. Most Native Americans were now living on reservations, or had been killed in warfare or decimated by disease. And so by the 1890s, the once thriving, diverse, vibrant Native American cultures were crumbling. Largely this has to do with the decimation of the buffalo. In 1800, there were around 30 million buffalo roaming the Great Plains. By the turn of the 20th century, there were less than 1,000 of them left. The Plains Indians had developed an entire way of life that was centered around the buffalo. And rapid expansion in the West in this period, really less than 50 years, caused catastrophic results for the buffalo. It is almost extinct by the end of the 19th century. The railroad, the rise of cattle farming and mining industries, the spread of farms across the landscape, the creation of white settlements and towns and cities in the West. These are all some of the reasons for the destruction of the buffalo. So American expansion in the West really changes the balance of nature. It changes the environment. The creation of the railroad, permanent railroad tracks going across the landscape, cutting down trees to build railroads and bridges. shooting wild game. This, sort of forever changes the environment of the region. And so for the Plains Indians tribes, the loss of the buffalo affected their whole way of life, their whole understanding of the universe. And they saw that their life is really being taken away from them. And they began to realize they're going to have to do something to fight for their lands, to fight for the buffalo. So much of the violence that takes place between Native Americans, white settlers, representatives of the American military in the late 19th century is really just Native Americans trying to defend and trying to hold on to their way of life. In 1867, Congress developed a new policy of trying to kind of isolate Native Americans on these small reservations, trying to teach them farming and quote unquote civilizing the tribes. As you might imagine, the small reservation policy really doesn't work very well. It ends up, sort of keeping Native Americans in poverty and isolation. The tribes end up, sort of going back to their old migratory ways. And so warfare breaks out again. And it takes, sort of really several decades of violence to, sort of finally suppress these Native American tribes. In the 1870s and 1880s, the government tried to kind of shift that policy towards assimilation, trying to urge that Native Americans be assimilated into white culture. So Congress began to adopt this policy in 1871 when it ended the practice of making treaties with tribes. So they were no longer treated as separate nations, and that meant that a lot of the power that the tribes once had was greatly weakened. There were also these efforts to try to train the younger generation to adjust to white culture. So in 1879, a group of Native Americans from the Plains were brought to a school known as the Carlisle School in Pennsylvania. At the school, they were taught practical skills. They were forced to cut their hair and wear quote unquote civilized clothing. They were forced to speak English, and they were forbidden from practicing their traditional customs. The motto of schools like this, like the Carlisle School and other, sort of boarding schools that were set up in lots of different places around the country, was to kill the Indian and save the man. And the final sort of link in this new policy of assimilation was land ownership. It was thought that land ownership would make Native Americans into responsible, self-reliant citizens. So in 1887, Congress passes the Dawes Act, which is really designed to kind of end tribal life entirely and distribute the lands that had previously been held by the tribes into small plots. And so it destroyed the communal ownership of Indian land. It gave these small farms to the head of individual families. Each family got 160 acres of land. If they decided to give up tribal life, then they could become American citizens. So about 47 million acres of land were distributed to Native Americans and their families. Another 90 million were set aside as reservations. And these lands ended up being kind of gradually sold off to white settlers. By 1900, there were only about 250,000 Native Americans in the entire United States. In 1492, of course, there had been more than 5 million. And by this time, most Native Americans are living on these reservations. They're living in extreme poverty, and they're losing a lot of their cultural distinctiveness of the different Native American tribes. As the Native Americans are losing their cultural identity, they begin to enter into the mythology of the West. Dime novels are very, very popular in the late 19th century, and a lot of these novels were set in the West, and they describe, sort of the Indian wars of the plains. They get turned into kind of entertainment and spectacle and a commercial business through things like Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show, which begins in 1883 and it runs for more than 30 years. And it really brings sort of Western mythology, this sort of mythologized West, to millions of people around the world. And Native Americans, as you can see here, played a very prominent role in Cody's show. They chased buffalo, they performed a war dance and attacked settlers' cabins. And in 1885, the great sort of Native American chief, Sitting Bull, who had vanquished General Custer at the Battle of Little Bighorn, he ends up joining Cody's troupe as a performer. So you want to think about what are some of the images of Native American life that are portrayed here? How do these images match up to reality? And why do you think the Western myth was so popular in the late 19th century? Why are Native Americans being portrayed as these warriors, as these violent warriors in this mythology? The West, between the Civil War and 1900, really experiences and witnesses one of the sort of biggest migrations in history. And obviously, this enormous change was noted by people at the time. And Americans reacted to what was happening in the West in different ways. In 1890, the census noted that for the first time, there was no longer a frontier line, meaning that there was no point where the West had not yet been heavily settled. And this announcement catches the attention of a young historian named Frederick Jackson Turner. And he thinks about this for a few years. And 3 years later, he delivers an address called The Significance of the Frontier in American History to a group of historians who are meeting in Chicago. So he develops what becomes known as his frontier thesis. And he explains his theory about how he thinks the frontier is this thing that has made American national character exceptional. That the fact that you have this sort of area, you always have this frontier where you can go and you can, kind of transform from, maybe somebody who had lived in the city to this sort of rugged individual who had, was sort of braved the frontier and who, had come out the better for it. And how this process of settling the frontier had made America sort of an exceptional country in the rest of the world. The frontier thesis is largely viewed today by historians as very, very flawed. Most historians have, kind of moved away from this idea. And really, the reality of Western history, historians in recent years have kind of rejected Turner's frontier thesis almost completely. And instead sort of advanced a much more complex, a much different view of the West. So new Western historians really see the West as this arena where there's all these conflicting interests. There's all these competing groups who are trying to define it. They tend to emphasize the racial diversity, the ethnic diversity in the West, the role that women as well as men played in settling the West, the struggles between different economic interests, and also looking at how Western settlement impacted the environment. So really focusing in on the environmental history of the region is another big part of modern Western history. And the settlement of the West is now really viewed more as a process of conquest. And it doesn't really stop in 1890. It continues on into the 20th century in many different ways. So it's a lot more complex than Hollywood maybe has portrayed the West and Western history. All right, so that brings us to the end of our talk for today. For those of you in my online class, or my on-site class rather, before coming to class on September 25th, you want to make sure you've read Chapter 17 in the American Yawp and make sure that you've done the reading quiz. And then you also want to make sure that you've read through the articles on history versus heritage that are online. And you have a course journal entry to complete as well. For those in my online course, we are going to be discussing those same readings and those same topics in our online discussion this week. So make sure you read those articles on history versus heritage as well. And I will see everybody. For those of you in my online course, I'll see you in class on Wednesday. And for those in my on-site course, I'll see you in class on Wednesday. And for those of you in my online course, I will see you in the discussion forums. And as always, if you have any questions, you can email me, you can post them in the discussion forum, come to office hours as well. And I will see everybody later this week. Take care, everyone.